The silence inside the house was treacherous. During the day, the rooms were bathed in a yellowish light that came through the aged curtains. But at night, the house was transformed. Whispers came from everywhere. Small cracks in the walls, soft scratches like fingernails scraping against wood. Mark Whitmore looked around with a tightness in his chest. He and his wife Sarah had finally got their own place to live after months of financial hardship. The house was big, old, with a spacious yard where their son Ben could play. And most importantly, it was ridiculously cheap, perhaps too low. "Dad?" Ben called out from the hallway. The boy's voice carried a tone of uncertainty. "There's something inside my bedroom wall." Mark exchanged a quick glance with Sarah before sighing and approaching his son. "What do you mean, champ?" "I heard someone whispering and scratching the wall next to my bed." Sarah forced a smile, kneeling down so that she was at Ben's height. "Honey, it's an old house. Old houses make strange noises at night. It could be the wind, wood rustling, that sort of thing." Ben didn't look convinced. His brown eyes moved to the dark corridor behind his parents. "But I heard a whisper saying my name. And before we continue with this intriguing story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. This helps us bring you more content like this." Now let's get back to the story. The first few days in the house passed without any major problems, except for the sporadic noises that seemed to intensify at night. The family dog, Max, was restless. He would growl at the walls, especially in the living room and Ben's bedroom. On one occasion, Sarah woke up in the middle of the night to find the animal standing at the basement door, his fur bristling, a low growl coming from his throat. Mark went downstairs sleepily, scratching the back of his neck. "What is it, Sarah?" She pointed at the dog, which was now advancing slowly, as if waiting for something to come out of it. "There's something wrong with this house. I can feel it." Mark looked down into the basement, feeling a slight shiver run up his spine. Suddenly, the dog jumped backwards, letting out a high-pitched bark. Sarah grabbed her husband's arm. "There's something there." Mark tried to rationalize. Maybe it was rats in the walls, or even some creaking old plumbing, but deep down, something was bothering him. The following afternoon, while organizing the basement, Sarah found something peculiar. Among the old boxes left by the previous residents, there was an old wooden cupboard, darkened by time. It was pushed up against the brick wall in the darkest corner of the basement. Curious, Sarah tried to drag it away, but it was heavier than it looked. "Mark, help me out here!" Her husband came downstairs, wiping his paint-smeared hands from the renovation. "What's wrong?" "This cupboard. It seems to be covering something." With a little effort, they moved the cabinet to one side, and then they saw it. An iron trapdoor built into the wall. Sarah swallowed. "What's that?" Mark knelt down and ran his hand over the cold, rusty surface. There was no handle, just a pair of rusty hinges and old nails that seemed to hold the structure shut. "Strange. I've never seen anything like this in a house. Do you think there's something behind it?" Before he could answer, a muffled sound came from inside the trapdoor. Sarah jumped back, holding her mouth. Mark froze. It was just the wood creaking, or a pipe. But Sarah knew better. She felt it. Something moved in there. That night, Ben refused to sleep alone. He shivered, clutching the blanket, and repeated that his friend inside the wall was hungry. Sarah spent the sleepless night by her son's side, listening intently for any noise. And then, at around 3 in the morning, she heard it. Soft scratching inside the walls. Sarah held her breath. The scratching continued, slow, methodical, as if something was crawling inside the structure of the house. She looked at the bedroom door and saw Max standing there, his eyes fixed on the wall. The dog took a hesitant step forward, growling softly. Then, without warning, he ran towards the wall and started scratching frantically. Ben cringed, crying softly. Sarah tried to calm her son down as she watched the dog become more and more desperate. And then, silence. Max stopped, his ears perked up. A second later, he let out a loud bark and ran out of the room, disappearing down the corridor. Sarah stood up quickly. "Mark, the dog." Mark emerged from across the hall, scratching his eyes sleepily. "What's wrong?" Sarah looked around. Max was nowhere to be seen. The dog was gone. They searched the whole house, but there was no sign of him. No door or window was open, not a crack big enough for Max to have escaped. And then when Mark went down to the basement to check if the dog was there, he saw it. In the rusty trap door, which had previously been nailed shut, there was now a gap of a few centimeters. And on the floor, a dark, sticky stain was slowly spreading across the wooden floor. Mark's breathing became heavy. He blinked a few times, trying to convince himself that he was imagining things, but the dark stain was still there, impregnated in the basement floor. The metallic smell gave away the obvious. It was blood. Sarah. Her voice came out low, almost a whisper. She walked slowly down the stairs, gripping the railing tightly. When her eyes met the dark puddle, her throat went dry. "My God, what is that?" Mark swallowed dryly and approached the trapdoor. It was still slightly ajar, as if something had pushed the lid from the inside. With trembling hands, he grasped the edge of the rusty iron and tried to lift the lid. It didn't budge. It was as if, despite the opening, it was still sealed by something invisible. "Mark, get out of there," Sarah begged. He ignored her. He took a crowbar and forced the lid. But nothing happened. The thing seemed locked from the inside again. Sarah took a step back, her heart racing. "Mark! Max! Do you think he—" Mark didn't want to answer. He didn't even want to imagine, but something inside that house had devoured the dog. After cleaning the stain from the floor, which was almost impossible as it seemed to have seeped into the wood, Mark decided to call his friend Todd, an experienced contractor, to inspect the house. Todd arrived the next morning, carrying a tool bag and a powerful flashlight. "So, do you think there's anything alive inside the wall?" he asked, looking at Mark skeptically. "I'm not saying it's an animal, but there's something wrong with this house." "The noises?" "Yes, and also the basement." Todd frowned. "Did you find anything down there?" Mark hesitated for a second before telling him about the trap door, the pool of blood, and the disappearance of the dog. The contractor listened in silence, without reacting. But when Mark had finished, Todd let out a long sigh. This isn't right." He picked up a small density meter and started tapping on the walls of a few rooms. After a while, he stopped and knocked harder on a specific area. The sound was hollow. "There's empty space in here." Mark and Sarah exchanged nervous glances. Todd took a stylus and made a small cut in the wallpaper. Behind him, there was no cement or bricks, just rotten wood. "I'll cut a bigger piece." He took a saw and began to cut a rectangle into the wall. As soon as he removed the piece of wood, a dark hole was revealed. Sarah approached cautiously and pointed the flashlight inside. What she saw made her stomach turn. There was a tunnel, a narrow, claustrophobic space, covered in layers of dust and dirt. But worst of all were the claw marks scattered across the floorboards, as if something lived in there, dragging itself from room to room. Todd's eyes widened. "Jesus Christ!" Sarah put her hand to her mouth. Mark took the flashlight and shone it deeper. The tunnel seemed to extend throughout the house, invisibly connecting rooms. Someone, or something, was using it to move around inside the house. And then, at the very end of the tunnel, something glowed. Two black, round eyes fixed on them. Sarah screamed and stepped back. Mark pulled Todd back and immediately pushed a piece of furniture into the hole. For a moment, no sound came from inside the tunnel, but then a whisper came. Low, soft. "I'm still hungry." After what they saw, Sarah wanted to get out of the house immediately. "We can't stay here, Mark. This isn't an animal. This isn't normal. Where are we going?" Mark wiped his hands across his face. "We can't afford anywhere else. We've just moved. You want to sell a house that people will ask why we're abandoning it?" Sarah felt angry and frustrated at the same time. "Our son is sleeping in a house with something lurking inside the walls. Do you want him to wake up without an arm?" Mark had no answer. He knew Sarah was right. But the next morning, it was Ben who terrified them even more. Sarah went to call him for coffee and found him sitting on the bedroom floor, drawing something in a notebook. "What are you drawing, darling?" Ben showed her the paper. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. The drawing showed a narrow corridor with wooden planks lined up, identical to the tunnel inside the walls. And in the middle of the drawing, there was a distorted figure with a slender body, long arms, and eyes as black as coal. "What's that, Ben?" The boy smiled innocently. "It's my new friend. He said he lived here before us." Sarah felt her stomach turn. He told you that?" "Uh-huh. He lives inside the walls. He said he was hungry, but I can't tell you because you won't understand." Sarah quickly knelt down, holding her son's shoulders. "Ben, listen to me. You can't talk about this, whatever it is. You can't, okay?" Ben frowned, as if his mother was being unfair. "But he said he likes me, and that soon I'll be able to play with him inside the walls." At the end of that night, Mark and Sarah were sitting at the kitchen table, not knowing what to do. Todd was in the basement trying to force the trapdoor to see if he could open it. "Maybe I can break it with a demolition hammer. It seems to be locked from the inside, but..." A noise. Something scraped against the concrete floor. Todd looked back. The trapdoor was ajar, open enough to see absolute darkness inside. "Mark, Sarah," they came to the basement door. "What is it?" Mark asked. Before Todd could answer, something came out of the darkness. A grey, bony hand grabbed his ankle and pulled hard. Todd fell backwards, screaming, "Help me!" Mark ran to hold him up, but another hand came out of the trapdoor, digging sharp claws into Todd's leg. Sarah just screamed as she watched Todd's body being pulled into the trapdoor, disappearing completely. His scream became muffled, and then silence. The trapdoor closed on its own. Mark looked at Sarah. Whatever was in that house, it was hunting now. The silence that followed Todd's death was suffocating. Mark felt his chest rise and fall rapidly, as if his body was struggling to accept what had just happened. Sarah trembled beside him, unable to take her eyes off the trapdoor. Todd had been pulled into the walls of the house, dragged into the darkness, without either of them being able to do anything. "This can't be happening," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Mark didn't answer. What could he say? He himself couldn't believe what he had seen, but something inside him knew. They were in danger. They needed to get out of that house. Now, Mark ran up the stairs to get Ben. His heart was pounding in his chest as he crossed the hall and entered his son's room. But when he opened the door, he found Ben sitting on the bed, smiling. "Hi, Dad." Mark stopped. His son's behavior was strange. He didn't seem scared. He seemed calm. "Ben, son, we're leaving here now. We're going to a hotel." The boy tilted his head to the side. "But my friend says we can't go." Mark felt a shiver run up his spine. "Your friend?" Ben pointed to the wall next to the bed. Mark looked in the direction of the gesture and froze. The paint on the wall was peeling in a strange shape, as if sharp hands had been scratching the surface for years. "He told me that you don't believe him, but you'll soon see." Mark approached his son and held his arms. "And Ben, listen to Dad. There's no one there." Ben blinked slowly and smiled. "He said you'll find out the hard way." Sarah entered the room, panting. "Mark, we have to go." But before Mark could reply, the lights flickered violently. The whole house shook. The walls creaked as if they were alive. And then the voices began, whispers, multiple voices overlapping. There were so many of them, echoing off the walls and the floor, that they seemed to come from inside the whole house. Sarah pulled Ben out of bed and hugged him tightly. Mark looked around, trying to understand what was happening. And then something came out of the wall. A cadaverous hand, grey and full of claws, tore through the paint and plaster, emerging as if it were breaking out of a cocoon. Then another hand. The whispering intensified, and little by little the thing emerged from the wall. It was tall, skeletal, its skin a mixture of grey and something damp and sickly. The bones seemed to protrude through the thin skin, as if it had been starving for a long time. The face was long, with no nose, no lips, just a huge mouthful of sharp teeth. The eyes were black as holes, shining in the dim light of Ben's room. Sarah stifled a scream. Mark felt his body lock up. The creature stretched its neck in an unnatural way, staring at them like an animal analyzing its prey. "It took you long enough to find me," said a low, distorted voice, which echoed from all directions at once. Sarah started to back away with Ben in her arms. Mark tried to stay calm. "What are you?" The creature tilted its head to the side. Then its body began to twitch. With horrible pops, it bent backwards, shoving part of its body into the wall again. The whispering intensified, and then she was gone. Mark and Sarah ran down the corridor, holding Ben tightly. They reached the front door and opened it violently. But on the other side, there was no street, there was no garden, there was no way out. The front door now faced a solid, dark, damp brick wall. Sarah screamed and took a step back. Mark tried to open a window. Another solid wall. The house had changed. They were trapped. Mark realized that the only possible way out was through the basement. He took Sarah and Ben by the hand and led them down the stairs. The air was heavier in there, as if they were entering something alive. And then they saw it. The trapdoor, once closed, was now completely open, and inside there was a stone staircase descending into absolute darkness. Sarah swallowed. "No, I'm not going in there." But Mark saw no other option. And then Ben muttered something that made their blood run cold. "Mom, I've been there before." Sarah turned to him, horrified. "What?" Ben looked at the hole in the ground. "In my dreams." Mark knew there was no choice. The house had trapped them. The only way out was in. He took Sarah and Ben by the hand, and then, together, they started down the trapdoor steps. The darkness swallowed them up, and above them, the trapdoor closed on its own, locking them in what seemed to be the heart of the house. Something was waiting for them down there, and this time, it was hungry. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and rotting flesh. The only light came from the shaky flashlight in Mark's hands, illuminating uneven stone steps that seemed to get lost in the infinite darkness. Sarah held Ben tightly. The boy was silent, his eyes wide, but his face showed no fear. It was as if he already knew what they would find down there. The sound of whispers still echoed around them, coming from the walls. They were overlapping voices, as if countless people were talking at the same time. And then, a sound came from the bottom of the staircase. A slow, dragging scraping. Something was waiting for them. The steps led down into a narrow corridor made of old bricks covered in slime. The walls seemed to breathe, pulsing slightly under the torchlight. Mark ran his hand along the wall. The texture was strangely soft, almost like cold skin. "This isn't right," he whispered. Sarah squeezed Ben's hand, pulling him closer. "We need to get out of here. Now." But Ben didn't move. He stared into the darkness ahead, as if he could hear something the others couldn't. "Ben?" Sarah called out nervously. The boy slowly turned his head towards his mother. "He said he's not going to let us go." Mark felt a cold chill in his stomach. "Who said that?" Ben looked at the floor. "The owner of the house." And then the lights flickered violently. The whole tunnel shook as if it were alive, and the sound of claws against stone echoed from the shadows. Sarah held Ben in her arms, and Mark quickly lifted the flashlight. The beam of light illuminated something moving in the depths of the corridor. And then they saw it. The creature was even more terrifying in the light. It was thin and elongated, with disproportionate limbs and protruding ribs, as if it hadn't eaten for centuries. Its black eyes shone as they met theirs. And then, she smiled. Her mouth widened in an impossible way, revealing sharp, rotten teeth attached to a jaw that crackled as it opened. Mark felt his heart race. Sarah started to back away, but Ben didn't move. The creature stepped forward. The sound of bones creaking and flesh stretching echoed through the tunnel. Mark held the flashlight tightly and lifted an iron bar he found lying on the ground. "Stay behind me." Sarah stood in front of Ben, shielding him with her own body. The creature advanced. Mark swung the iron bar, hitting it in the arm. The impact made a dry, hollow sound, as if it had hit something very fragile. But the creature didn't react. On the contrary, it laughed, a grotesque, distorted sound that came from all directions at once. Sarah screamed, pulling Ben up and running down the tunnel. Mark tried to keep up, but the creature moved too fast. In an instant, she was in front of him, trapped inside the wall, only her head and arms sticking out of the rotten brick. Its black eyes shone just a few centimeters from his, and then she whispered directly into Mark's mind. "Do you want to know how many I've eaten?" Mark screamed in pain, holding his head as he felt images invade his mind. He saw everything. He saw bodies rotting behind walls. He saw children who had been missing for centuries, screaming silently inside the house. He saw entire families being dragged into the dark. And then he saw Todd. His friend was lying on the floor of the tunnel, his face frozen in a scream of horror, but he was still alive. His eyes were moving frantically, begging for help. Mark tried to run to him, but the creature moved again. The mouth opened wider, and the whispers grew louder. Sarah screamed from the other side of the tunnel, "Mark, come soon!" Mark fought back the terror, held the iron bar with all his strength, and hit the creature in the face. It screamed, recoiling for a second. Mark ran to Todd, but as soon as he got close, he realized it was too late. His friend's skin was stuck to the wall, as if he was being absorbed into the house. Todd tried to say something, but then his mouth closed on its own, and his eyes went out. The house devoured him. Mark felt the bile rise in his throat, but there was no time. He ran to where Sarah and Ben were. Sarah held Ben tightly, the boy burying his face in her shoulder. The tunnel began to shake again. The house was alive. Mark took his wife's hand and ran, but then the floor disappeared, and everyone fell. They plummeted into a dark hall, falling onto something soft and damp. Sarah groaned in pain as she got up, but when she looked around, her blood ran cold. They were surrounded by bodies. There were dozens, maybe hundreds, mummified remains of people stuck to the walls, their mouths open in eternal screams. Mark helped Sarah to her feet and held Ben in his arms. The boy looked at everything with a blank expression, and then he spoke. "They never left here." Sarah looked at her son, horrified. "Ben!" The boy slowly turned his head towards his mother, and his eyes were black. Mark took a step back. "No!" The whisper came again, stronger than ever. "Hunger needs to be satisfied." Ben smiled, and then something moved behind them. The creature was finally complete, and it wanted more. The darkness seemed to pulse around them. The voices of the dead whispered from the bricks, words chopped up and indecipherable. The air was thick with the smell of rot and dried blood. Mark held Ben in his arms, but the boy wasn't the same. His eyes were now black holes, reflecting the presence of the thing that lived inside the house. Sarah covered her mouth with her hands, her whole body shaking, and then the creature moved. It was even more hideous in the dim light. Its grey, parched skin was covered in open wounds, where flesh and bones seemed to fuse to the walls. It was part of the house. It was the house itself, and now it wanted to devour them. Mark and Sarah started to back away, but with every step they took, the walls seemed to close in tighter. The creature watched them hungrily, its mouth abnormally wide, sharp teeth dripping with saliva. "Do you think you're the first?" Its voice echoed inside their heads, like a whisper coming from everywhere. "So many families before you, so many bodies hidden inside me." Sarah squeezed Mark's hand, her eyes wide. "She's keeping us here. We're part of the house now." Mark looked at Ben, who still didn't blink. "What did you do to him?" The creature tilted his head, the bones in his neck cracking. "He heard me first." Mark looked at his son, trying to find some trace of the Ben he knew. "Ben, son, are you listening to me?" Ben smiled slowly. "He's gone now, Dad. I'm part of the house now." Sarah sobbed, tears streaming down her face. Mark nodded. No, No! He grabbed Ben by the shoulders and shook him. Wake up, son! Don't listen to that thing! For a second, Ben blinked. His body shook. Dad! He whispered, confused. But then, the creature screamed. The sound was deafening, an inhuman roar, and the entire tunnel shook violently. Ben squirmed in Mark's arms, letting out a high-pitched scream as if something was pulling him back. Mark held his son with all his strength. Sarah fell to her knees in despair. Mark! He's disappearing! Ben screamed again, his black eyes filling with tears. Dad! Mom! She's inside me! Mark looked around in despair. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to save his son. But then he remembered the old diaries they had found in the basement. Stay away from the darkness. The creature cannot exist where there is light. Mark reached into his pocket for his lighter. Sarah looked at him, terrified. What are you doing? Mark grabbed a makeshift torch, soaking an old rag with flammable liquid from a forgotten bottle on the floor. He looked at his wife, his eyes full of fear and determination. We're going to burn this house down. Sarah hesitated. But what about Ben? Mark looked at his son, who was still fighting the creature inside him. Then, without a second thought, he lit the torch. The fire illuminated the macabre hall, casting grotesque shadows against the walls. The creature roared, recoiling as if the light itself was burning it. The voices of the dead began to scream in agony. Mark threw the torch against the rotten ceiling. The flames spread quickly. Sarah pulled Ben away, while Mark set fire to the entire tunnel. The creature twisted, trying to escape, but the fire coursed through its veins, consuming its deformed skin. The walls began to crumble. Run! Mark shouted, grabbing Ben in his arms and pulling Sarah by the hand. The tunnel was collapsing, stones and wood falling around them as they ran. The creature roared, now completely engulfed in flames. The fire spread to the upper floors, and within minutes the whole house was on fire. Mark found an old staircase leading back down to the basement. Let's go! Let's go! Sarah was the first to climb, holding Ben tightly. Mark looked back one last time. The creature was writhing in the flames, its eyes full of hatred and pain. This won't end here, she whispered, her voice falling apart as the flames crackled. Mark ran upstairs, narrowly escaping before the whole house collapsed. When they got outside, the sky was red with fire, and the house imploded in on itself, swallowing everything that remained inside. Sarah fell to her knees on the grass, holding Ben and crying uncontrollably. Mark fell beside them, his chest heaving. They had survived, but at too high a cost. Sarah brushed Ben's sweat-soaked hair away from his face and looked at him. Darling, are you all right? The boy blinked a few times, his eyes returning to normal. He looked at his mother and then at Mark. His body began to shake. Mom, Dad, I can still hear you. Mark froze. What? Ben started to cry. She's in here. She's still here. The boy sobbed, shaking his head as if something was inside his mind, and then he smiled. But it wasn't Ben's smile. Sarah screamed, and the fire consumed the house completely, burying the truth forever. Or so they thought. The house collapsed in flames, its rubble lighting up the night like a burning tomb. The smell of burning wood and smoke permeated the air, but for Mark and Sarah, that didn't mean victory. Ben was different. He trembled in his mother's arms, his eyes filled with tears, murmuring over and over again, "She's still here, inside my head." Sarah held her son's face in her hands, desperate. "Ben, darling, it's me. Can you hear me?" The boy looked at his mother. His eyes were brown again. For a moment, he looked normal. "Mommy, I'm scared." Sarah hugged him tightly, sobbing. Mark knelt beside them, his whole body exhausted, his lungs burning with smoke. The house had died. But the horror wasn't over. They drove straight to the hospital without looking back. Sarah didn't let go of Ben for a second, holding his hand the whole time. Mark drove as if he was afraid that something was following them. When they arrived, Ben was immediately taken for observation. The doctor looked at them strangely when he heard Sarah's confused explanation. He saw horrible things. He was in a dark place for a long time. The doctor frowned. Was he kidnapped? Sarah hesitated. Mark simply didn't answer. No one would believe the truth, but Ben knew. While he was being examined by the doctors, he remained silent, staring at the white wall. He could still hear the whispers, and worse, he understood what they were saying. Sarah refused to leave Ben's side, so Mark went to get a coffee from reception. When he returned to the bedroom, he found Sarah asleep in the armchair. And Ben. Ben was sitting up in bed, awake, staring at his reflection in the window. Mark felt a shiver run up his spine. "Son?" Ben slowly turned his head. "She's here, Dad." Mark looked at the window. It was just glass. But when he blinked, he saw a dark figure reflected there. "No," he whispered. Ben blinked slowly and his eyes went black again for a brief second. "She said she doesn't like fire, but now she doesn't need the walls anymore." The light in the room flickered violently. The heart monitors beeped on their own. And then the whispers came again. Mark pulled Ben to him, hugging him tightly. "You're safe, son. I won't let anything happen to you." Ben clung to his father, trembling, but Mark felt something strange on his son's skin, a growing warmth as if something was coming out of him. And then, in the corner of the room, a shadow moved on its own. Something was trying to get out. Sarah woke up startled and looked around, seeing the shadow crawling up the wall. She stood up, her chest rising and falling rapidly. This can't be happening." Mark held her hand. "She wasn't trapped in the house, Sarah." Sarah looked at him, terrified. "What do you mean?" Mark looked at Ben. The boy was pale, his eyes wide. "She didn't die. She came with me." Sarah collapsed in despair. The creature was never trapped in the house. It was trapped in the people who lived in it. And now it was inside Ben. The fire didn't kill it. It only freed it. After a week in hospital, the doctors said Ben was fine. There were no signs of physical trauma, and he looked healthy. But Mark and Sarah knew that wasn't true. Ben was too quiet. His eyes would sometimes change, going dark for a brief second. Sometimes he woke up in the middle of the night, talking to himself. Sometimes the lights would flicker on around him. Sarah tried to ignore it, tried to tell herself that she was imagining things. Until one night, she woke up to find Ben sitting on the edge of the bed. "Ben, what's wrong?" He slowly turned his face towards his mother. And then he smiled. But it wasn't Ben's smile. It was hers. The creature. Whispers filled the room. Sarah tried to scream, but her body wouldn't move. Ben leaned forward and whispered, "Mom, I'm hungry." And then the lights went out. 2 months later, the house was no more. The fire had consumed everything, reducing every wall to ashes and leaving only charred ground. Mark and Sarah moved away, trying to forget everything that had happened, trying to convince themselves that they were safe now. But the truth? They never slept peacefully again. Since the night in hospital, Ben had changed. He still laughed. He still played. He still hugged his mother and father. But he wasn't the same Ben anymore. Mark could feel it. Sarah knew it. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would wake up to find Ben standing in the hallway, staring at the wall. Sometimes he would say strange things. One night, Sarah found him drawing something in his notebook. She knelt down beside him and asked, trying to keep her voice steady, "What are you drawing, darling?" Ben smiled and turned the paper over for his mother to see. Sarah felt her stomach turn. In the drawing, there was a thin, elongated silhouette with eyes as black as holes. Behind the creature, there were many others, and they all seemed to be coming out of a body. Sarah looked at Ben, her heart beating wildly. "Ben, who are they?" The boy tilted his head and smiled the wrong way. "My new friends." Sarah choked back a sob. "And where do they live, darling?" Ben touched his own chest, and then he whispered softly, "In here." Sarah jumped up, putting her hand to her mouth. Ben laughed softly and went back to drawing. Sarah ran into the bedroom, locking the door behind her. Her knees failed her and she fell to the floor. She knew the truth now. The creature no longer needed the walls. It had found a new home, and one day it would come out again. 20 years later, the land of the house was sold to a developer. A new neighborhood was built on the site. New houses, new families, new children. And on the first night after the opening, a little 7-year-old girl woke up in the middle of the night. She looked into the darkness of her bedroom and felt a strange chill. Then she pulled the covers up to her chin and whispered, "Who's there?" The answer came from inside the wall. A low, scratchy voice. Familiar. "I'm hungry." And then the scratching started again. What did you think of this outcome? Leave your opinion in the comments. We'd love to know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your like to support our work. See you in the next video.